It's a Q&A session. Let's start. I want to ask the first question.
Let me ask a question, okay? Very interesting talk. As you know, materials play a very important role in technology innovation, right? About 3 years ago, President Obama announced the Material General Initiatives, okay? So my question is, after 3 years, can you tell us what's the impact of his initiative to the material innovation in U.S. and other countries?
That's a very good question. The question basically asks, students can be a very important contributor to innovation and entrepreneurship, but with a 3-year education experience, how much can they accomplish? Well, I think it's a ready, aim, fire proposition. During the first 3 years, it's sort of a readiness stage. The aim and fire comes later. At least by the time they finish their education, they'll know within the following 2 years whether they want to go on to graduate studies or whether they want to invent a new job or go out into the job market and find a new job. If they choose to invent a new job, then of course they've eventually got to get to the fire stage. And that takes much longer. It takes very hard work. Google didn't happen overnight. I know Sergey Brin. I know how many years they worked on the concept and how he worked hard on converting Markov chains to an algorithm that worked for data retrieval. But look where he is today. I don't think he's at Google anymore, but I think there's a reason for that. I think he's probably on his yacht somewhere.
I have a question which may be not fully related to your talk, which, by the way, was very, very interesting and a lot of important issues. But it relates to what you have said about recession. The recession, you mentioned your experience of ministers from various countries coming to you as director of NSF and then saying their main preoccupation before was nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and now it is changing to innovation and entrepreneurship, right?
Not quite, but I'll answer your question in a moment.
Okay, so my question is this. In fact, the recession, because you mentioned recession, was not due to a lack of innovation and entrepreneurship before. It is due to something completely different, which is the misbehavior of financial institutions in which innovation played a role, misused innovation, but still innovation. So it's maybe not completely related to what you said, but has education in universities also something to contribute to that? Because it's, after all, it's really the reason of the recession, right?
Yes, you're absolutely right. The cause of the recession was due to factors that were a disaster ready to happen. And it accumulated to a point where it went over a tipping point. But the other point is that the best recovery that could have been expected based on that traumatic event was a slow, shallow recovery. And we've seen a slow, shallow recovery. It's not the usual kind of recovery where you have a big dip and then it comes back almost immediately. The consequence of the recession was, of course, loss of jobs. And some jobs that went away will never come back. Because what do companies do when they're in a recession? They trim the workforce. They cut costs. They improve productivity. And they have no one stopping them from doing that to speak of. So when the economy starts coming back, of course, they come back into production. But what about the thousands of people who are no longer employed? So the way to get those people employed is to start new enterprises and to create jobs for them. And that's the reason why the ministers were concerned about innovation and entrepreneurship, because right now there's a surplus of workers in the world. More so in many countries than here well, there are many here in China as well, but in the United States there's still quite a few, but percentage-wise we're not that bad off. But nevertheless, everyone has felt that pinch, and everyone's trying to respond the best they can. Now that doesn't mean that biotechnology, information technology, and nanotechnology has gone away. There are new business starting every day because the investment in those technologies started a long time ago. And they're not going to be a complete answer to the problem we're talking about, but they'll make a contribution.
Okay. Other question? Yeah, please.
Okay, my name is Davey. I just want to ask how do you see the subjective and objective measurement of achievements in innovation and entrepreneurship? Because higher education might take a very long time for commercialization success that give some economic impact and financial impact rather than a social impact.
That's a very good question. Thank you for the question. Did everyone hear the question? The question really had to do with how will innovation and entrepreneurship make an impact. Maybe I've shortened the question too much. Actually, part of your question had a timing element to it because, as you point out, some innovations take a long time. And the time to reduce a new concept, a new fundamental concept to a marketable product or a marketable service can be a long time. And that's true. But on average, that timeline is getting shorter all the time, primarily because there are more minds around the world focused on it. And as more scientists and more engineers become educated, these translate into opportunities. If they can break the Gordian knot, if they can solve the enigma and come up with a solution in 3 years instead of 18 years, then they'll be the benefactors of having achieved that. So yeah, it'll be some kind of a distribution. I don't know whether it'll be Gaussian, but it'll be some kind of a distribution. And some of those new concepts will see the light of day much sooner than others, and others will be in the other tail on the other side. But you know, there's a certain amount of uncertainty and a certain amount of risk. I wouldn't say a certain amount. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of risk in trying to start up a new business and trying to innovate a new product or a new service. And so one has to understand how to manage risk, but also one has to understand how to deal with it in terms of developing a new business.
Other question? Yeah, Professor Tony Chen.
You know, you have a special vantage point of having served in both academia, private industry, and government in the U.S. You travel around the world. I've done a little bit of that with you. So my question is, what makes the U.S. having been so successful in innovation? I think it's widely recognized that the U.S. is by far, you know, I mean, the most successful. You mentioned Google. There are many companies like that. I ask because I know many people from around the world want to learn from the successful elements in the U.S. Let's say take Hong Kong, China, Asia. And think nobody has found a secret ingredient or a secret recipe for that. So based on your observation, is it just funding? Is it some sort of systemic thing? Is it cultural? Maybe you can give us some insight.
Well, thank you, Tony. I think your voice was loud enough that most people heard your question. There are fundamental reasons why I think we're successful in the U.S. First and foremost, it's a free and open society, and that attracts top talent from around the world to bring their ideas and their talent to the U.S. Not every successful innovator is a long-term resident of the United States. A lot of them have only been over in the last 5 or 6 years. So I think that's one factor. I think another factor is that we're a very competitive society. You know, you can count the number of religions that you can think of, and you get a long list of maybe 50 or 60. But there's only one religion in the United States. That's professional organized sports. And it's the competitive nature of competitive professional organized sports that excite people. But more than that, it's risk-taking. It's the fact that risk is accepted, and risk is expected, and risk is even rewarded. And you'll find that most of the successful entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley have developed a lot of scar tissue, and they've learned from failures, and that's respected. And in some societies, I mentioned that there are impediments in terms of cultural. These are contextual, cultural, economics, and societal risks. And I think the notion of taking a risk, failing, and not losing face, but being encouraged to try again, is a very important element in being successful as a nation in innovation. So I would cite those factors.
Another question?
So I'm a City University student. So basically, most of the lecture you have talked about is a big picture of the innovation and the globalization. So my question is that as a student, so what would you advise us to do in the future in addressing the innovation and grasping the opportunities of the globalization? Thanks.
That's a very good question, and free advice is worth what you pay for it, right? I think the first factor is look opportunity in the face, and don't be afraid to put your toe in the water. Tony mentioned that I've been in industry, I've been in academia, and I've been in government, a lot of government. Opportunities will come your way, but you have to be willing to step forward and accept them. And that's going to be a hard decision. It may be the most important decision you make in your life. So you have to analyze your abilities, you have to analyze your capabilities, and you have to determine what your strong points and weak points are. And if you feel that this is a challenge that you can make a difference in your life and in the life of others, then take it. And don't look back. Globalization and internationalization isn't going to go away because the world is getting smaller. So you're going to be globally involved whether you like it or not. It's just going to happen, especially if you go in the private sector. There aren't very many companies, even small companies, left in the U.S. or many other parts of the world that only deal with national markets. They deal with global markets. And I think that's a reality. But the advantage of having, and I think on average, it's happening even today. The average person, by the time they're 30, 35 years old, has already had about 4 or 5 jobs or experiences, work experiences, maybe more, many more. That's not going to go away. The day where you can, it's still possible today that you can join a company and they're going to look after your career and they're going to educate you and they're going to move you up the line. I think that day is long gone. What's happening today is you're expected to manage your own career. You have to call your own shots. And if you're useful to the company, they'll continue to employ you. If you're not useful to the company, they'll tell you that too.
Okay. Oh, a lot of.
Hi, my name is Carl. So as universities seek innovation, so there is greater integration with the private sector. So increasingly more funds are coming from private sources, corporate sources. In such a context, how do we ensure, well, okay, the hand that feeds is less likely to be bitten. So in such a context, how do we ensure that universities and its research are not subjected to commercial interest, especially that compromises, objectivity, independence, and the disinterestedness that are central to academic research. So, how do we ensure that the university as a critical forum and its ability to speak truth to power are not undermined? Thank you.
I think a partial answer to it is you have to take the reins in your hands, and you have to define what the ground rules are, and you have to recognize what conflict of interest really means, and define it in tangible terms that all faculty members can understand. And when industry comes and knocks on your doors, they have to understand what you can do and what you can't do, what you're not willing to do. And you're not a gun for hire. You have a job to do. But on the other hand, there is value at a university that companies want. But if they want it badly enough, they have to play your game. You don't have to play their game. So the faculty itself has to determine what your policies are going to be, what the ground rules are going to be. There are a lot of universities that have been through that path that you could get advice from. There's probably a lot on the website. I'm sure there's a large literature on the subject, so there's a lot of help. But that's my answer to your question.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is on the issue of global collaboration. My question is that how these top universities are willing to collaborate with lower universities, especially in low-developed countries. For example, you were talking about the move from the west to the east. What about the collaboration from the east, north to the south, especially for the sub-Saharan Africa? How these top universities are willing to collaborate in reciprocity benefit in this context?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good question. In working with a developing country, most developing countries now recognize that if they're going to be less than developing, and if they're going to break their dependency on the rest of the world, they have to solve their own problems. And so there's sort of a big brother part of this to help developing countries and especially universities in solving some of these problems. Now, what's in it for the university? Well, part of it is outreach, which is a major responsibility of universities to share know-how, share experience, and in some cases provide some training. But there's also other reasons, and that is that not all the research that is interesting to do exists right here at CityU within within the confines of these buildings that are all around you. If you really want to understand what food security is all about, if you want to understand what finding sources of potable water and developing the sanitation necessary to be sure that it's potable when it touches the tongue, not when it just comes out of the spigot. If you want to solve problems of how do you teach some of the topics in technology, what can be shared openly, or what are you willing to share openly in terms of courseware, in terms of syllabus, in terms of research techniques, these sorts of things. If you're in the field of biodiversity, you're certainly not going to do very much good for yourself by doing your research here in Hong Kong. You've got to get out to the biodiverse areas in the Amazon and in the tropics, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and other parts of the world where they only understand 10% of their biodiversity. The other 90% is not very well known yet. So for a person in zoology or plant biology and many other topics, that's their living laboratory. That's where they're going to make their reputation. You know, I could go on with other examples, but I think you really have to look hard at where your opportunities are. And in working with many developing countries, it has to be on an equal basis. I think universities anywhere in the world want a quid pro quo. They want to share what they know with what you know and come up with something that has some synergy in it. It's greater than the sum of the parts. In my experience in our Global Policy Research Institute and working abroad is that hosting workshops where faculty from universities that you feel would provide a good partnership opportunity can share not only their research achievements, but also their research ideas, where they would like to go. You would find, surprisingly, that there's a rich area where there's a common ground, where you can suddenly come up with a collaboration, where you can work together on a project. And then the problem is, well, then how do you get it funded? And that's tough. If I can just give a couple examples, it's sort of an extension of your question, but I think it may be helpful. The National Science Foundation in the United States is a domestic funding agency. It's not an international funding agency. So it can fund research that is international in nature, that may be a collaborative research project with another scientist abroad, whether it's in an advanced economy or a developing economy, but they can't provide funding for the international participant. So what came to my attention was that we have an agency called the Agency for International Development, and that's the agency that provides foreign aid. And most developing countries fall under the category of countries that can receive foreign aid. Some of that is given in a block grant to the country, and the country establishes its own priorities for how they want to expend those funds. But it's quite possible that through a little bit of effort, international partners that can see where the benefit could come from a joint program can convince their government or convince USAID to provide funding for their part of the research. And NSF then will provide funding for the domestic part of the research. So that's one mechanism. And there are other mechanisms. There are a growing number of foundations now that are funding programs in developing countries. One of the biggest is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. For example, in food security, we're trying to develop packaging that is aseptic and will allow long-term storage of agricultural products in some developing countries, especially in Eastern and Western Africa. And about half the food grown in those countries is wasted, either through spoilage, through mold, because of inadequate food drying, or because of short shelf life. And while it's quite possible with proper packaging, you can package them under conditions where they are aseptic and where bacteria and mold and other contagions or toxins can't develop. So you can actually store it for a year, and that will bridge one growing period to the next growing period, and that suddenly gives you a much higher food security than you had before. And those are technologies that come out of some of the major research universities in the countries who discover how to do those things. But to actually marshal an effort within a region of the world to actually put it to use oftentimes takes resources from major foundations, or through the use of foreign aid. And those are decisions that have to be made by, unfortunately, policymakers, because they're the ones who are the decision makers on where that funding goes. I'd much rather see it go for food security than for weapons, which unfortunately is often the case.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's thank again Professor Beckman. May I invite Professor Ko to give you a small gift to show our appreciation. Okay, thank you very much for coming to this distinct lecture.